right, you ready for this? You guys sent in a ton of stuff about demagogues and democracy.
Oh, yeah.
We've got excerpts from letters, some modern political analysis, even some economic modeling. Seems like you're really trying to understand how these forces work together,
Mm-hmm.
especially here in America, right?
But pretty timely topic, wouldn't you say? I mean, this whole question goes back to the very beginning.
Oh, for sure. So, before we go any further, let's make sure everyone's on the same page. What exactly is a demagogue?
Right?
The Vanderbilt Project on Unity and American Democracy had a pretty good definition. They said a demagogue is a leader who gets power by playing on people's feelings and prejudices
Okay.
instead of using, logic and reason.
Makes sense.
What do you think? Does that sound right?
Yeah, spot on. They're really good at manipulating people,
Mm-hmm.
making promises they can't keep or that might even hurt us later.
Mm.
It's all about winning right now, even if it means sacrificing the bigger picture.
And you know what's wild? The founding fathers were already worried about this stuff way back in the 1700s. Like, in 1787, George Washington was writing letters to Lafayette and David Stewart,
Mm-hmm.
and he was super clear about the dangers of a power-hungry leader taking advantage of any kind of chaos.
Oh, absolutely.
He saw it as a threat to national security and to the whole legal system.
Yeah, it's incredible how aware they were of this danger, even as they were building the system.
Right.
They were trying to balance, the will of the people with some safeguards to protect against abuse of power.
So did they actually build any specific protections into the system to, prevent a demagogue from rising to power?
Well, take the Electoral College, for example.
Okay.
Initially, it was supposed to be a filter against demagoguery.
Oh, interesting.
The idea was that you'd have these informed electors choosing the president, not just the general public voting directly.
So they didn't completely trust the average person to make the best decision.
Well, they were worried that a really charismatic leader could sway public opinion too easily.
Right.
They wanted a layer of deliberation, a group of people who could think it through and make a reasoned decision, even if it went against what was popular.
Which makes you wonder if maybe they were onto something, because today the Electoral College doesn't really work that way anymore.
No, not really. Now, electors mostly just confirm the popular vote in their states.
Exactly.
So it raises an interesting question, have we outgrown the safeguards the Founding Fathers put in place?
Right.
Or do we need to come up with new ones for today's world?
That's a really good question. And speaking of early American history, our sources take us right into the drama of the 1800 election.
Yeah.
The showdown between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr.
Right.
Now, both of them were technically from the Democratic-Republican Party.
Uh-huh.
But get this, Alexander Hamilton, who is a hardcore Federalist,
Yeah.
Basically the other party.
Yeah.
He was actually more afraid of Burr winning.
Oh, really?
And it wasn't just about party politics either.
Right.
Hamilton saw something dangerous in Burr's ambition. He believed Burr was willing to put his own interests above the country's.
So it was more about Burr's character than his political stance.
Exactly. In fact, Hamilton had some pretty harsh words about Burr.
Like what?
He called him deficient in honesty and said he was one of the most unprincipled men in the United States.
Wow.
He was seriously concerned about what Burr might do with power.
This really shows you that judging a politician's character has always been important.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even more than just focusing on their party.
Definitely a lesson that still applies today.
Absolutely.
Okay, now let's jump ahead a few decades to the 1830s.
Okay.
We've got another warning about the dangers of demagogues, but this time it's from Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, interesting.
In his
Yeah.
1838 Lyceum address, Lincoln warned against what he called mob rule. When passion and emotion just completely override reason and logic.
Right.
He said that kind of atmosphere can be incredibly dangerous for a democracy.
Which is kind of scary because that sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it?
It does, a little bit.
What really strikes me about Lincoln's address is how he focused on how demagogues undermine the rule of law, which is like the foundation of a stable society.
So we've got the Founding Fathers worried about demagogues, Hamilton basically choosing the lesser evil over a good character, and then Lincoln warning us about mob mentality.
Yeah.
This concern keeps popping up over and over throughout American history.
It does, doesn't it?
And what's interesting? There's some economic research that actually backs all of this up.
Really?
Yeah, there's this fascinating paper that goes deep into the economics of demagoguery.
Okay.
It's pretty dense, but the main takeaway is that short-term thinking, both by voters and leaders, can be incredibly dangerous for a nation's long-term growth and stability,
I see.
and that demagogues actually thrive in this kind of short-term environment.
That makes sense.
So can you give us an example of how that plays out in the real world?
Sure. Imagine a demagogue comes along and promises to slash taxes and increase spending right now.
Okay.
Sounds pretty good, right?
Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't want that?
Exactly. But those immediate benefits might come with a really high cost later on.
How so?
Well, it could mean cutting essential investments, like in education or infrastructure.
Things that are important for the future.
Exactly. Crucial for long-term growth.
It's like eating dessert first and skipping your vegetables.
Exactly. It feels good in the moment,
Yeah.
but it's not going to sustain you in the long run.
And what happens when those economic problems start to show up?
Well, that's when the demagogue can point the finger at an outside enemy
Uh-huh.
or some shadowy conspiracy.
Right. Shift the blame.
Exactly. They're really good at exploiting people's fears and frustrations. And that just divides the nation even more and makes it easier to justify even more short-sighted and selfish policies.
So it's a vicious cycle.
Absolutely. The researchers actually call it a death spiral.
A death spiral? That sounds pretty ominous.
Yeah, it's not a pretty picture.
To be honest, that paper sounded a little depressing.
I can see why you'd say that.
Is there any hope for us? Can we actually do anything to strengthen our democracy and make it more resistant to this kind of manipulation?
There is hope, yes. The paper does offer some solutions. It suggests that a strong economy, strong institutions, and high levels of capital can make a democracy much more resistant to these demagogic tactics.
Okay, so when you say capital, you don't just mean money, right?
Right. It's broader than that. It includes things like social trust, a sense of civic duty, and faith in the democratic process itself.
The things that bind us together.
Exactly. You could almost think of it as an immune system for democracy.
So it's not enough to just have the right laws on the books or good economic policies. We need a culture that values these things and actively participates in making them work.
That's a great way to put it. It's about all of us playing our part. Precisely. And this research underscores that we can't take our democracy for granted.
Right.
We have to actively protect and nurture it.
Like tending a garden.
Exactly. Okay, so we've traveled from the 1700s to Lincoln to modern-day economics.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
And what's clear is that this worry about demagogues is not new. It's a recurring theme in American history.
Absolutely. But before we talk about what this all means for us today, I'm curious, out of all of this, what's really stood out to you?
What's really resonating with me is how this threat, this pattern of demagoguery, has persisted across different times and situations. It's a reminder that this isn't a battle that we win once and for all. It's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah.
And every generation has to face it in their own way.
It really is a recurring challenge.
Absolutely.
And it makes you wonder, are we up to the task?
That's the big question.
We'll dive into that and a whole lot more in part 2 of this deep dive. As we were talking about how this whole demagogue thing keeps popping up throughout history, it really hit me that there's this common thread running through all the examples.
Oh, yeah.
Like whether it's Washington, Hamilton, even Lincoln, they all seem to be worried about this underlying danger of short-term thinking. Like prioritizing immediate satisfaction, even if it could cost us later.
That instant gratification.
Yeah. And doesn't that make us super vulnerable to a demagogue's message?
Totally. It's almost like we're programmed to look for the easy way out.
The quick fix?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We crave instant results, and demagogues know how to exploit that.
Makes sense.
They give us simple answers to complicated problems. They often scapegoat and demonize certain groups.
Creating that us versus them thing.
Exactly. And it's a tactic that's been around forever.
Oh, for sure. It's so much easier to just blame someone else than to actually deal with the tough issues.
Right.
But that research paper we talked about earlier.
The one about the death spiral.
Yeah. Did it offer any solutions? Can we actually do anything to make our democracy stronger and more resistant to these tactics?
It's not a lost cause, but it does take work.
Okay.
And a real commitment to building a more resilient society.
So how do we do that?
Well, the paper highlighted a few key things. First, a strong and productive economy is super important.
So if people are doing well economically, they're less likely to fall for a demagogue's promises.
Exactly. When the economy is healthy, people tend to be more optimistic, more focused on the future.
They feel more secure.
Exactly. It creates this buffer against those who try to prey on fear and uncertainty.
That makes a lot of sense. What else did they suggest?
Strong institutions are crucial too.
Like what?
Well, things like a fair and impartial judicial system, a free press that holds power accountable, and a system of checks and balances to prevent anyone from getting too much power.
It's easy to take those things for granted.
I know, right?
But they're the pillars of a democracy.
They are. They protect our basic values and rights even when we're facing pressure from demagogues.
So they're like the foundation of a house.
Exactly. If the foundation is strong,
it can withstand a storm.
exactly. But if it's weak, the whole thing is at risk.
That's a great analogy. And you also mentioned capital, not just financial capital.
Right, social capital is important too.
Like social trust.
Uh-huh. The belief that we can rely on each other.
And on our institutions.
Right, and civic engagement. People actually participating in their communities and in politics.
And feeling like we're all working toward the same goal.
Exactly. All those things bind us together as a society, make it harder for a demagogue to divide us.
So it's not enough to just have the right laws and institutions. We need a culture that really values these things.
Absolutely, and that takes work.
We need to actively protect and nurture those things.
It's like building a fortress from the inside out.
A fortress of reason and responsibility. I like it.
And remember, it's not a one-time thing.
Right.
We have to constantly maintain and reinforce these foundations.
It's a never-ending battle.
It is, against complacency and short-sightedness.
So it's a call to action for all of us.
Exactly. We can't just sit back and watch.
We each have to do our part to safeguard democracy.
I agree.
You know, all this talk about social media, critical thinking, made me think of something.
What's that?
The sources didn't really touch on this directly,
Okay.
but it seems really important. So we've been talking about how important education and critical thinking are for resisting demagogues.
Right.
But doesn't that make you wonder if, like, social media itself is actually making us more susceptible?
That's a good point.
With all the algorithms and echo chambers and stuff?
Yeah, I think that's a question worth exploring.
For sure.
I mean, on the one hand, social media can be a powerful tool.
Oh, yeah, for connecting people, sharing information.
Right, exactly.
But then on the other hand, it can be used to spread all this misinformation.
Oh, absolutely.
And reinforce biases.
And create those echo chambers you were talking about.
It's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it really is.
It can amplify both the good and the bad.
And when it comes to demagogues, they're usually pretty good at using social media to their advantage.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, they can bypass traditional media.
Go directly to their followers.
Exactly. And they can tailor their message to specific groups.
Exploiting those existing divisions.
Exactly.
So what do we do? How do we deal with this?
I think it goes back to critical thinking. We have to understand how social media works. Like how those algorithms shape what we see and how we think.
Right.
And we have to be skeptical.
Of those crazy headlines.
Yeah. Be willing to look at different perspectives.
So it's about being, like, active information consumer.
Right. Not just letting it wash over you.
Engage with it.
Exactly.
And think about our own biases, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Be open to being wrong.
Be willing to change your mind if you see new evidence.
That's a hard one, though.
It is. It's easy to get stuck in our own little bubbles.
Yeah, surrounded by people who already agree with us.
It takes effort to step outside of that. But it's so important for a democracy to have that kind of dialogue.
We need to be having those tough conversations.
Right. With people who see things differently.
Trying to understand each other.
Otherwise, we're just yelling into the void.
Yeah, just reinforcing our own opinions.
Making it even easier for demagogues to exploit those divisions.
Exactly. So I guess the big takeaway from this whole deep dive is that demagogues thrive on division, fear, and short-term thinking.
That's it in a nutshell.
But we can fight back.
We can.
By building a stronger democracy, thinking critically.
And getting involved.
Participating in the process.
That's the key.
Well said. From Washington's worries in 1787 to social media today.
Wow, yeah.
This deep dive has shown us that demagogues are a problem that never really goes away. It needs our constant attention and effort.
Absolutely.
What really stuck with you from all of this? Let us know what you think, and if you have a topic you want to deep dive into, send us your sources. We'll see you next time on the